The unequivocal character of the ontological interpretation of death should be made more secure by explicitly bringing to mind what this interpretation cannot ask about, and where it would be useless to expect information and instruction. In the broadest sense, death is a phenomenon of life. Lifer must be understood as a kind of being to which belongs a being in the world. It can only be ontologically defined in a privative orientation to Dasein. Dasein, too, can be considered as mere life. For the biological and physiological line of questioning, it then moves into the sphere of being sane, which we know as the world of animals and plants. In this field, dates and statistics about the lifespan of plants, animals, and human beings can be ontically ascertained. Connections between the lifespan, reproduction, and growth can be known. The kinds of death, the causes, arrangements, and ways of its occurrence can be investigated. An ontological problematic underlies this biological and ontic investigation of death. We must still ask how the essence of death is defined in terms of the essence of life. In a certain sense, the ontic inquiry into death has already decided about this. More or less clarified preconceptions of life and death are operative in it. These preliminary concepts need to be sketched out in the ontology of Dasein. Within the ontology of Dasein, which has priority over an ontology of life, the existential analytic of death is subordinate to a characterization of the fundamental constitution of Dasein. We call the ending of what is alive perishing Während. Dasein, too, has its physiological death of the kind appropriate to anything that lives. It has it not ontically in isolation, but is also determined by its primordial kind of being. Dasein, too, can end without authentically dying, though on the other hand, qua Dasein, it does not simply perish. We call this intermediate phenomenon its demise Abelbeen. Let the term dying sterben stand for the way of being in which Dasein is toward its death. Thus we can say that Dasein never perishes. Dasein can only demise as long as it dies. The medical and biological inquiry into demising can attain results which can also become significant ontologically if the fundamental orientation is ensured for an existential interpretation of death. Or must sickness and death in general, even from a medical point of view, be conceived primarily as existential phenomena? The existential interpretation of death is prior to any biology and ontology of life. But it also is the foundation for any biographico-historical or ethnologico-psychological inquiry into death. A typology of dying, characterizing the states and ways in which a demise is experienced, already presupposes the concept of death. Moreover, a psychology of dying gives information about the life of the dying person rather than about dying itself. That is only a reflection of the fact that when Dasein dies, and even when it dies authentically, it is not a matter of an experience of, or in, its factical demise. Similarly, the interpretations of death in primitive peoples, of their behavior toward death in magic and cult, throw light primarily on the understanding of Dasein, but the interpretation of this understanding already requires an existential analytic and a corresponding concept of death. The ontological analysis of being toward the end, on the other hand, does not anticipate any existential stance toward death. If death is defined as the end of Dasein, that is, of being in the world, no ontic decision has been made as to whether, after death, another being sane is still possible, either higher or lower, whether Dasein lives on or even, outliving itself, is immortal. Nor is anything decided ontically about the otherworldly and its possibility, any more than about the thisworldly, as if norms and rules for behavior toward death should be proposed for edification. But our analysis of death remains purely thisworldly, in that it interprets the phenomenon solely with respect to the question of how it enters into each and every Dasein as its possibility of being. We cannot even ask with any methodological assurance about what is after death, until death is understood in its full ontological essence. Whether such a question presents a possible theoretical question at all is not to be decided here. This worldly, ontological interpretation of death comes before any ontic, otherworldly speculation. Finally, an existential analysis of death lies outside the scope of what might be discussed under the rubric of a metaphysics of death. Questions of how and when death came into the world, what meaning it can and should have as an evil and suffering in the whole of beings. These are questions that necessarily presuppose an understanding not only of the character of being of death, but the ontology of the universe of beings as a whole, as well as the ontological clarification of evil and negativity in particular. The existential analysis is methodically prior to the questions of a biology, psychology theodicy, and theology of death. Taken ontically, the results of the analysis show the peculiar formality and emptiness of any ontological characterization. However, that must not make us blind to the rich and complex structure of the phenomenon. Since Dasein never becomes accessible at all as something objectively present, because being possible belongs in its own way to its kind of being, even less may we expect to simply read off the ontological structure of death, if indeed death is an eminent possibility of Dasein. On the other hand, our analysis cannot be supported by an idea of death that has been devised arbitrarily and at random. We can restrain this arbitrariness only by giving beforehand an ontological characterization of the kind of being in which the end enters into the average everydayness of Dasein. For this, we need to envisage fully the structures of everydayness worked out earlier. The fact that existential possibilities of being toward death have their resonance in an existential analysis of death is implied by the essence of any ontological inquiry. All the more explicitly, then, must an existential neutrality go together with the existential conceptual definition, especially with regard to death, where the character of possibility of Dasein can be revealed most clearly of all. The existential problematic aims solely at developing the ontological structure of the being toward the end of